Brookhill had always been the kind of place where time seemed to move a little slower. The streets were lined with tall maple trees that turned golden in the fall, and the small cafe on the corner always smelled of fresh bread. Most of the residents had lived there for generations, and people knew each other by name. Nothing dangerous ever happened, and the local police station usually dealt with minor disputes or lost pets. That peaceful routine was shattered one Tuesday morning when a mail carrier noticed something unusual at the home of Mrs. Eleanor Hayes. Her front door was slightly open, and the morning paper remained untouched on the porch. At first, the carrier assumed Mrs. Hayes had simply forgotten to close the door, but when knocking received no response, unease began to set in. Inside the house, the mail carrier made a horrifying discovery. The living room was a scene of complete chaos. A large mirror on the wall was cracked in two, and a vase lay shattered across the floor, its flowers dried and scattered as if they'd been there for days. Furniture had been pushed aside in strange, uneven patterns, as though someone had moved about in a frantic rush for no clear reason. The most unsettling detail was the silence that filled the house. Not even the normally ticking mantel clock made a sound. The carrier quickly contacted the authorities, and within minutes, police cars arrived, their flashing lights casting an eerie glow over the quiet neighborhood. The investigators entered cautiously, expecting perhaps a burglary gone wrong, but the deeper they went into the house, the less the scene resembled any ordinary crime. There were long, thin scratches on the inside of the front door, as if someone had used a sharp object to carve into the wood. Some scratches were shallow, while others dug deeply into the surface, forming chaotic lines without any recognizable pattern. It didn't look like a forced entry. It looked like something done slowly and intentionally from the inside. They proceeded down the hallway and discovered Mrs. Hayes in the kitchen. She was lying face down near the back door. There were no visible wounds that clearly explained what had happened to her, but the look on her face suggested she had died in fear. The scene became even more disturbing as investigators noticed a thin layer of sand spread across the kitchen floor. It was strange because there were no signs of it at any of the entrances. It looked as though the sand had been carefully placed instead of being tracked in. On the countertop, there was an old photograph album, open to a page showing people from decades earlier. The photos were slightly faded, but someone had recently touched them, leaving faint fingerprints on the edges. In the corner of the kitchen, a small wooden chair had been overturned, and beside it lay an object that had no clear place in the house, a smooth stone shaped like a teardrop. It had no markings or signs of wear, as though it had been placed there deliberately. The investigators were left with more questions than answers, and as they stepped back outside, neighbors had already begun gathering in small, frightened groups, whispering about what might have happened inside the Hayes home. The investigation at the Hayes residence quickly grew more complicated as the forensic team began a thorough examination of the entire house. What initially seemed like a simple case of unexplained violence now revealed layers of uncertainty. In the living room, one officer noticed that the long, thin scratches were not random at all. When she traced the lines carefully with gloved fingers, she realized they followed a repeating pattern. It looked like someone had tried to carve a series of straight lines that overlapped 3 times. No one could immediately determine what they represented, but the precision behind the scratches suggested a deliberate effort. On the windowsills, small fragments of glass were found even though none of the windows were broken. The glass pieces were smooth on one side and jagged on the other, as if someone had cut around the edges and removed specific sections. The forensic team collected samples of the sand found in the kitchen, hoping to identify its origin. What puzzled them was that the sand did not contain any traces of dirt or plant material, meaning it had not been carried in from a garden or a natural walking path. It seemed cleaned or filtered. Near the back door, they discovered a row of faint footprints leading toward the center of the room, but these prints abruptly stopped as though the person had vanished into thin air. No signs of movement continued beyond those prints, which left an unsettling silence in their place. Meanwhile, officers took the photo album found on the kitchen counter to their station for analysis. Inside, they found dozens of photographs dating back to the 1970s and 1980s. Most of the images showed townspeople posing at school events, local parades, and family gatherings. At first, nothing looked suspicious. But one officer noticed that certain photos had tiny handwritten numbers on the back. When the team cross-referenced these numbers, they discovered they corresponded to addresses of houses scattered all over Brookhill. Strangely, many of these addresses belonged to people who had lived in the town for decades but were not openly close to Mrs. Hayes. The more investigators studied the information, the more they realized that each numbered photograph represented one of the older families in Brookhill. None of those families knew that their photographs had been kept in that album or that someone had recently touched them. When investigators visited the homes connected to the numbered photos, they found similar thin scratches on the homeowners' front doors, barely visible unless examined closely. Most of the residents had not noticed the markings. A few admitted hearing light tapping at their doors late at night, but brushed it off as tree branches moving in the wind. The unsettling similarities between the Hayes home and the other houses led investigators to believe that someone had been moving carefully through the neighborhood, marking and studying their targets. The sand samples taken from one of the other houses matched the sand found in the Hayes residence, confirming their fears. Whoever had entered Mrs. Hayes's house had likely visited the others first. Each new detail raised more questions. The police now realized that what had seemed like an isolated event might be just the beginning of something far more chilling, and Brookhill's peaceful surface was slowly revealing a hidden layer of silent terror. Police began interviewing the families associated with the numbered photographs, hoping to uncover a past connection that could explain why they were being targeted. Each household gave similar accounts. They remembered Mrs. Hayes as a stern woman who rarely smiled and kept mostly to herself, but none of them had any active disputes with her. Many of the townspeople vaguely recalled an incident from decades ago when Mrs. Hayes had accused several locals of stealing valuable jewelry from her deceased husband's belongings. At the time, the accusations caused a short-lived scandal that divided the small community. Some believed her, while others insisted it was a false claim meant to damage reputations. Eventually, the police found no concrete evidence, and the case faded from public attention. No one thought it would resurface after so many years. As the investigators pulled old records related to that forgotten case, the similarities between the current events and the past incident became harder to dismiss. The people photographed in the album were the same individuals Mrs. Hayes had once accused. But what confused the investigators was why these people were being targeted now, years after tensions had settled. The theory of Mrs. Hayes acting alone no longer made sense, especially since she had been the first victim. It became clear that someone else had been quietly watching and waiting. While revisiting one of the older houses, an officer discovered something deeply disturbing in a backyard shed. Hidden beneath a loose wooden plank was a stack of torn papers, each containing hand-drawn symbols that matched the scratches found at the Hayes residence. The symbols were drawn over and over with increasing precision, as though someone had been practicing. Beside the stack was a small glass jar filled with the same fine sand. When the jar was opened, it released a sharp odor unlike normal soil or beach sand. The sample was immediately sent to the lab for further testing. Back at the police station, another breakthrough occurred. A detective working through local archives found a mention of an old riverbed on the edge of town that had dried up after a major flood. The report mentioned that, long ago, children used to play in the riverbed and collect strangely shaped stones that were smoothed by the water flow. One of those stones was shown in a photo from 1963, and it looked exactly like the teardrop-shaped stone found near Mrs. Hayes's body. The timing matched the period when Mrs. Hayes's husband was still alive. Investigators began to suspect that the riverbed held an important connection to the current events. The sand, the stone, and the symbols all suggested a link to something that had originated there. Some of the older residents recalled rumors about unexplained disappearances near the riverbed decades ago but dismissed them as childhood stories. Now, those stories took on a frightening new relevance. The police organized a detailed map of Brookhill and marked the homes of the photographed residents along with the location of the dried riverbed. Viewed together, the map revealed a circular path connecting all the targeted households, with the riverbed at its center. The realization sent a chill through the team. The pattern was intentional, and whatever was unfolding had been set into motion long before they began to notice it. Rumors spread quickly through Brookhill as word of the hidden symbols and sand jars began to circulate. Residents no longer felt safe in their own homes. At night, lights remained on in every house, and families gathered together in their living rooms, unable to sleep. The streets, usually calm and welcoming even after dark, were now completely empty after sunset. The sound of a dog barking or the rustle of tree branches was enough to send people into a quiet panic. The police increased patrols and tried to reassure the public, but even the officers were unsettled by the strange clues and the eerie calm that had settled over the town. The situation escalated when one of the families marked in the photo album failed to answer their phone or respond to knocks at their door. When officers entered the home, they found it abandoned. No signs of struggle were visible, but the entire house had been rearranged. The furniture was placed in geometric patterns on the floor, and a thin line of sand traced a spiral from the doorway to the center of the living room. A single photograph from the old album lay in the center of the spiral, untouched. The family's personal belongings were still in the home, suggesting they had left suddenly without taking anything. Investigators felt a growing sense of urgency. They believed whoever had taken the family was close to completing a plan that none of them fully understood. Meanwhile, the lab returned results on the sand samples. The sand contained microscopic traces of minerals that were only found in the dried riverbed outside town. This confirmed the earlier suspicion that the riverbed was connected to the case. The police launched a coordinated search of the area. As officers approached the site, they noticed the air was unnaturally still, and the forest surrounding the riverbed was completely silent, with no birds or insects making a sound. Near the center of the dried riverbed, they found freshly disturbed dirt arranged in circular patterns similar to the scratches on the doors and walls of the victims' homes. In the middle of the largest circle, several of the missing family members' shoes were arranged in a deliberate pattern. The discovery deepened the mystery, but yet again, there were no signs of the missing people themselves. Investigators expanded the search and found a narrow trail leading into a dense patch of trees. The trail was difficult to see unless one stood directly above it. The ground along the trail was covered in fine sand that formed arrow-like shapes pointing deeper into the woods. As officers followed the path, they spotted more of the smooth stones like the one found in Mrs. Hayes's kitchen, placed carefully at intervals along the trail. Each stone was turned at a slightly different angle, as though guiding anyone who followed in a specific direction. By the time night fell, the search team had reached an old, overgrown fence hidden beneath layers of vines and leaves. Beyond it was a collapsed structure that looked like it had once been a small cabin or storage shed. Oddly, the door of the structure remained intact, standing upright even though the rest of the building had crumbled. On the door was the same carved symbol found in the Hayes residence. The team halted, realizing they had approached the heart of whatever had been quietly unfolding in Brookhill for decades. The search team stood motionless for a moment, staring at the door standing alone among the collapsed boards and debris. A cold breeze moved through the trees as they carefully approached. With a deep breath, one of the officers pushed open the door. It creaked loudly, but nothing stood behind it except a steep staircase that descended into darkness. The officers silently descended, flashlights sweeping across damp walls made of old stone. The air grew colder with each step. At the bottom of the stairs, they entered a large underground room. What they saw made even the most experienced investigators freeze in disbelief. Lining the walls were dozens of old photographs pinned to the stone by metal spikes. Each photograph had a carefully placed red X on the face of a different resident. In the center of the room was a large table covered in maps, newspaper clippings, and hand-sketched drawings of the spiral and circular patterns seen in the victims' homes. Nearby, rows of glass jars filled with the same fine sand were arranged in perfect order, each labeled with a name and address. On a separate shelf were stacks of the smooth teardrop-shaped stones, cleaned and polished like prized possessions. Everything in the room indicated a long and carefully constructed plan. Suddenly, a soft, muffled sound came from behind one of the stone walls. The officers quickly located a concealed door and forced it open. Inside, sitting on the floor with hands and feet bound, were the missing residents. Their eyes were wide with terror, but they were alive. One of them whispered that a man had brought them there and told them they would soon complete the circle. Before the officers could ask further questions, a sound echoed from somewhere behind them, a slow, deliberate footstep. They turned their flashlights toward the noise and saw a figure standing at the bottom of the staircase. It was a young man in his late 20s. His clothes were dusty, and his expression was calm. He showed no signs of fear or surprise. When he stepped forward, the officers instructed him to stop and raise their weapons, but the man simply lifted a smooth stone from his pocket and placed it gently on the ground. He didn't attempt to run. Instead, he stared at the large map on the table, as though admiring a finished work of art. The officers arrested him without resistance. During questioning, the man quietly revealed that he was the grandson of a man who had once lived in Brookhill. His grandfather had been falsely accused and publicly shamed by Mrs. Hayes and the others. Unable to handle the humiliation, he disappeared and was never seen again. The grandson grew up hearing stories of betrayal and loss. Over time, those stories turned into an obsession, and he began collecting information, waiting for the moment to extract revenge for what had been done. The scratches were his way of marking the path. The sand and stones were symbols from the riverbed where his grandfather used to take him as a child. The residents were safely returned to their homes, but Brookhill was never the same. Even after the man was taken away, people felt a constant unease. What disturbed investigators most was not just the brutality of the planned revenge, but the fact that it had been carried out with such patience and precision. The quiet town, once proud of its safety, would forever remember the chilling events that revealed how deeply buried secrets can return when least expected.